Ho, ho, ho from Southern California, the merriest place to bury a body. You've stumbled upon the holiday edition of Just the Tip-Sters with Melissa Morgan. If you have a tip on anything from murder to mayhem to just plain weird things you want Melissa to know about, tell us about it by sending an email to jttipsters@gmail.com. You just might hear your tip on the podcast. And now, here's your host, your holly jolly homicide huntress, Melissa Morgan.
More cowbell. Hell yeah, with the cowbell. Welcome to Just the Tip-Sters, America's favorite podcast covering murder, true crime, mayhem, yoga, stock tips, jam recipes, anything you got, we want to hear it. I love to sound like Zelda Rubinstein from Poltergeist. All tips are welcome here. All tips are welcome here. I realize that's not specifically a murder reference, but it is still a fascinating film with a really good cast of complete and utter weirdos. So this wonderful podcast came about because I have had a lifelong interest in dead people, murders, murderers, dead people, maybe even who just died of natural causes, just dead people in general. I remember being, I'm probably 9 or 10 and being afraid of dying and asking my mom, look, am I going to die? And she's like, well, yeah, we're all going to die someday. And I'm like, oh, thanks. No, she actually was much better about that. And being raised in a religious household, was not sure if I was floating up to heaven or was going to be really great, nitrous fertilizer for trees. I really didn't know exactly what was happening, but I'm still fascinated by it. I am absolutely fascinated by what happens after we die, if anything. Still the biggest, most beautiful mystery and what makes the journey more interesting, I think. So my dead people obsession started pretty young, and it started with Helter Skelter. I think that a large amount of bodies all at once when you're from a small town in Kentucky is fascinating and overwhelming. Of course, people die throughout our lives. I was fascinated by that. I worked at a printing company in my early 20s that was the only printing company in northern Kentucky that used a special old-fashioned linotype Heidelberg printing machine for prayer cards for funeral homes. And I would beg to deliver the prayer cards to each funeral home, and the funeral directors knew I was fascinated by forensics, by the mortuary sciences, and they would let me sometimes view the bodies, not in a disrespectful way, but in a very respectful way. That's one of the things I grew to really love about the mortuary sciences. Is, for the most part, I mean, you get your occasional, necrophiliac, but I mean, that's hopefully pretty few and far between. It was very fascinating to see the bodies up close and be given information about formaldehyde and how it works and what it does and how long it's been in use and how Cincinnati was. When I say I grew up in northern Kentucky, it's 10 minutes from Cincinnati. So it's in the metro area, as my wonderful husband, producer, calls it.
It's the tri-state.
It's the tri-state. It is.
And how old were you when you were going from funeral home to funeral home? I
didn't like take a tour of the funeral homes like, the Graveline tour in Hollywood. I worked at this printing company, and there were, it's a small town, so there were probably 5 funeral homes within a very short distance. People die a lot faster in the Midwest, I guess. And I would deliver the prayer cards. So I was 24, but I'd been fascinated before then. And I actually thought about going to mortuary college, but I realized, as fascinating as it was to me to see what happens to the human body after we pass, I could not handle the grief. So part of being a mortician is the grunt work, picking up the body and preparing the body, but you have to talk to family members and, pick out flowers and tombstones and caskets. And I would just one tear and I'd be a puddle. So they would just be ushering me out in the back room all the time. So I'd be horrible. And then I thought about working in a lab in a forensics, trying into the forensic sciences, but I'm horrible at math and science. So that probably went by the wayside. I've taken classes in criminal, not criminal defense, like criminal, like if you're trying to be a cop, except I wasn't going to be a cop. These were classes a long time ago, but they were
criminology.
Thank you. That's the word. Thanks, producer Mark.
I had to Google it really quick.
I bet you didn't. But anyway, so I've been fascinated by that since I was pretty young. And more importantly, I think the psychology behind what makes someone do that. And I didn't, when I feared death, I didn't necessarily fear what happens after. What I feared was something crappy happening before I knew it wasn't happening, like being, murdered. I feared, being killed or experiencing, let's just be honest, experiencing a lot of pain before I died. I wondered what it took for someone to kill another, to snuff out the light in another person's eyes. And apparently this doesn't take that much. I thought it would take a long time, many years, building up to, what can I do? No, it can sometimes come really quickly. The amazing Lieutenant Kenda on Homicide Hunter on the ID channel says there are 3 reasons that people kill. Love, money, and revenge. So love, you can kind of get that sort of. Revenge, absolutely everyone can understand, coming home and rubbing your hands together and plotting the death of someone who's, cut you off in traffic, something like that. Or maybe that's just me. And then the big one is money. And that is frighteningly the thing that precedes a lot of deaths, planned and unplanned. But money, I don't know where the greed comes from. I wish I could blame a larger, a society like, oh my gosh, it's everyone else's fault that these people kill their family members for 20 grand in an insurance policy. But no, I feel like there's, a lot of research to shows there's a chip missing or an extra chip in the brain of those who are, kook and nutty.
Well, what about the ones like the one you're going to talk about today where it's not money necessarily, it's not love, it's not, what was the other one, jealousy?
Revenge.
When the killer is just plain batshit crazy.
Well, I think that might be, category number 4, but could absolutely be the umbrella across the first 3. All right. So I'm sure in Ronald Gene Simmons's mind, he thought he was doing something right. It could be him covering his hideous crimes, but anyway, let's get into this. So a retired military serviceman, Ronald Gene Simmons, murdered 14 members of his family, including a daughter he had sexually abused and the child he'd fathered with her, a former coworker, and a stranger. And that brings the number of deaths to 16. And he wounded 4 others, thinking he'd actually killed 20 people. So Ronald Gene Simmons was born in 1940 in Chicago to Loretta and William Simmons. And before he was 2.5, his father died of a stroke. So within a year, his mother remarried a man who was a civil engineer and moved the family to Little Rock, Arkansas. This plays into the scene of what happens later. So that question, Mark, is a great question. So I'm not sure. There were no indications that his stepfather was horrific to him, but why he, after all of the years that he had lived and had children, moved them back to Little Rock is, that wasn't a snap decision. I feel like he moved them back there for a reason, whether it's to enact revenge against his stepfather and his mother. I don't know. Or it could just be, like you said, he's batshit crazy and one of his chips is missing. But in September of 1957, Gene Simmons, which is how he liked to be known, as opposed to Paul Stanley, dropped out of school and joined the U.S. Navy and was first stationed in Washington State. And he met Rebecca Ulibarri, and he married her in New Mexico in 1960. So then over the next 18 years, they had 7 kids. In 1963, he left the Navy for 2 years, but then joined the Air Force. I think there's another part to this. He had trouble blending in the private sector. I feel like he probably needed the military to maybe keep him a little bit more in line. But he stayed in the military for, 20 years. And this is the part I find frightening. He was awarded the Bronze Star, the Republic of Vietnam Gallantry Cross for his service as an airman. That sounds like bullshit. The Republic of Vietnam Gallantry Cross. Those words don't even...
They gave those out.
No, they didn't. I think he just made that shit up. But he got an Air Force ribbon for excellent marksmanship, which, that will come into play later, obviously. He retired from the Air Force and the military in 1979 with the rank of Master Sergeant, which is, he should be given, Master of Nothing. But anyway, so in 1981, they're still living in New Mexico, and the Department of Human Services comes to them and says, we think you fathered the child of your 17-year-old daughter, Sheila, and we think you've been sexually abusing her. And he admitted nothing, but knew he was probably going to be arrested soon. So he took the family. He blackmailed his wife, poor Rebecca, who said, he told her that if she did not come with him, that Human Services would blame her for letting him do that, and they would take the kids and arrest her. So they moved the entire family to Arkansas. So not exactly Little Rock, but a place called Dover. And he bought a 13-acre tract of land that he called Mockingbird Hill. Probably some sort of, Beatles reference or biblical reference, I'm going to guess. It's, 13 acres of land sounds like it could be nice. No. This was a disgusting compound that he had put a huge privacy fence around. Some parts of it were 10 feet tall, like a makeshift privacy fence, probably made out of like weird wooden pallets and, barbed wire and trash bags. He just sounds like a real charmer. He taped together 2 older model mobile homes to make one big home. They had no telephone.
Did you say he taped them together?
He taped them together.
With what, duct tape or something?
It could have been.
My God.
It could have been Gorilla Tape. I don't know, Mark. I wasn't there. Could have been painter's tape. What am I? I don't have everything. Taped them together to form one large mobile home. No telephone, no indoor plumbing, and surrounded by this lovely makeshift privacy fence. The pictures of the crime scenes shows 2 outhouses. So I'm guessing he was very modest, even though he liked to molest his own daughters, and more about him later. But there was a men's and a women's outhouse. I think that's lovely that he separated them. They were beautiful green corrugated plastic with roofs on them. They had a lovely half moon cutout on the front door. There was, each stall had its own giant Sears fall catalog.
I'm not sure that's true, but
all right, I made that part up too. But anyway, so here's where I think he had a problem. After getting out of the military and moving his sad, creepy family to Arkansas, he had a string of low-paying jobs, and he was obviously a smart man, but a crazy man, batshit crazy. So he would go from Dover to like 8 miles away to Russellville, Arkansas. So he had these series of low-paying jobs, and every single job he was fired from for inappropriate sexual behavior. Now, this is the early 1980s. In my mind, the swinging 80s was like, grab a boob, they're sticking out there for you. You could probably do a lot more. Not probably. You could do a lot more than now. I'm guessing he fucked, killed, and ate a coworker, and the boss was like, "What's that? What's that in the microwave? Is that Deborah? Is Deborah in the microwave?
Do you think
Gene,
that really...
I've got to let you go, Gene. Why is Deborah in the microwave?"
This is all supposition. We should point out for
it
the
is
lawyers
supposition.
who are listening.
However, I don't know what you had to do in the 80s to be fired from your job at the Mini Mart, as a purchasing person at like a lumber company. I mean, he had, he was an accounts receivable clerk. He had lots of, great jobs, really sad, low-paying jobs for his brain, and he gets fired from every single one. So if I were an employee of the BAU, the Behavioral Analysis Unit, I would say that the event on December 18th of 1987 was his stressor. And that is where he was fired from the Sinclair Mini Mart after working there for a year and a half after numerous reports of inappropriate sexual advances. So I'm guessing if you're working at a mini mart, at the Sinclair Mini Mart in Russellville, Arkansas, and you get fired in 1987 for inappropriate sexual advances, you had to have prison raped 18 women with a Slim Jim.
Wait, again, for the lawyers, that is supposition.
I am thinking you had to do something like that.
Point taken, though. Point taken.
Okay, thank you. So he is fired. It takes him approximately 4 days to come up with this great plan. In the meantime, his wife, Rebecca, has really wanted to get the entire family together. It could have been a meeting of the minds where Rebecca was planning her escape and Gene Simmons / Paul Stanley was planning his murder, because she had written a letter to the oldest son, Billy, who was 29. By the way, he doesn't make it out of this. And said, I'm a prisoner here. The kids are prisoners. We need to get out. So Rebecca knew things were getting bad. I don't know if... I know the letter was written before he was fired from the Sinclair Mini Mart for Slim Jim rape. But, this is obviously decades of abuse and terror and imprisonment. So it was a big old-fashioned Christmas. Everyone was coming to the compound where you had to shit, in a hole. So that's fun. So shortly before, in the morning of December 22nd, he just decided, well, you know what, today's the day. I'm just going to start today. So he killed his wife, Rebecca, in bed. And the police, when the home was eventually entered, found a bloody bed with no body, and they didn't know why, and they'll find out later. Killed his wife, Rebecca, in bed. Shot his eldest son, Gene, with a .22, and he was still in his underwear, and then strangled his 3-year-old granddaughter, by his oldest son, Gene. He strangled her in her bed. So, of the 16 people, 8 were shot, 7 were strangled, and 1 was drowned. So we'll also get to that later. So this is still December 22nd. So he dumped the bodies of his wife, his oldest son, and his granddaughter in a cesspit, that's what they're calling it, that he had made his children dig earlier. Perhaps the outhouse was getting full. I think when you got that many people on your 13 acres, there's only so many places you can shit. And then suddenly you got to dig a cesspit, which my friend Angela knows something about because she lived with her first husband on a property that was, told to her that it had plumbing, and it sort of did, I think, at one time. I do remember having to dump a bucket of water down the toilet to flush it after I peed, and I think you weren't allowed to shit. I think you had to shit in a bucket, or I don't really remember, but all I know is God bless my beloved Angela for putting up with that. She now has an exquisite house with like 5 bathrooms. I think that probably...
I think maybe she was making up for the whole...
I think that it just happened that way. But it's a beautiful thing that she can shit on any floor of her house and flush the toilet and not have to go outside. I mentioned this, and I didn't really want to bring it up, but in the house that she and her first husband lived in, I don't know why he would do that. Probably because he was 6'8". So he would take the turds from the cesspit and throw them on top of it was frozen. It was wintertime in Kentucky. Throw them on top of a storage shed. I don't know what that was about. I don't know if that was an act of aggression or it was like a monkey, just like there. So his turds are on top of the storage shed, and my beloved friend Angela was walking by one day, and a turd slipped off the roof and hit her in the head, and it was frozen, and it like knocked her silly. I mean, thank God it was frozen. We didn't want to get stains on her, on her pretty Russian fur hat that I'm sure she was wearing around the property. But yeah, no, it knocked her. I think it knocked her out. It may have knocked her down, but I think it knocked her out. It was
okay.
Hit in the head with the frozen shit sickle. So those are one of those stories you want to tell your grandkids. So anyway, back to Gene Simmons.
Yeah, we veered a little.
Sorry, yeah, it's probably a little bit warmer. No, it was cold. I remember the sheriff's department saying they wondered why there was no fire in the fireplace when they showed up. That's because everyone was dead. But anyway, so he dumps his wife, his oldest son, and his granddaughter into the shit pit and covers them up. And then his school-age children come home from school. There are 4 of them. Eddie, 14, Marianne, 11, Becky, 8, and his oldest school-age daughter, Loretta, 17. So he tells each of them that he has a present for them, but he has to show them one at a time. So here's where it's very smart. He doesn't just start shooting because, he actually made a statement to his wife's sister later on. Did you see the gun I was using? I was afraid they would. Why did you shoot them so many times? Well, did you see the gun I was using? I was afraid they would get away. So he next time, I think, in his next life, he should use a larger powered firearm instead of a .22 pistol. So he brought them in one at a time. Loretta strangled her, and then Eddie, Marianne, and Becky. I don't know exactly what happened, but apparently maybe Loretta woke up and was not actually dead because not only did he strangle her, he then drowned her in the rain barrel, which, is, I feel like if a family member has a rain barrel, you should probably just know immediately they probably plan on killing you. It's just, it could just be me, but I think rain barrel equals, nutter butter. And actually, speaking of that, it's a perfect time for our first sponsor, Ferd's Rain Barrels. So if you need to collect water because you're living in 2 mobile homes that are taped together, if you would like to collect water to, quietly remove pesky members of your family, try Ferd's Rain Barrels. They're biodegradable. They're made from the best wood on earth. And there's very little waste from leakage if you can put your family members in face first. This is what they have found out from their experience. There's very little splashing if you put them in face first. Don't go feet first because they got a chance to get out. Face first. So read the reviews. My problems went away with some water from Jesus's tear ducts and my Ferd's Rain Barrel. How can you beat that review? So if you go to www.ferdsrainbarrels.gov, you get a 10% discount on your first barrel. Just put the code JT Tipsters Holiday in the promo code section and happy collecting.
Oh, we love our sponsors.
Our sponsors.
They're the best.
The best. So he now has 7 bodies. He around midday on the 26th, the remaining members of the family have arrived for the Christmas visit. So the first one that day to be killed was his son Billy and his wife Renata, who were both shot in the head. He then strangled and drowned the 20-month-old son Trey. He shot and killed his oldest daughter Sheila, the one who he'd sexually abused, and the child that he'd fathered with her 7-year-old Sylvia. And then he finally, his 21-month-old grandson, Michael, was strangled. So he laid those bodies in a row on the lounge and then figured out, other people are coming. So he covers them with coats and then, except for Sheila, who's covered with her mother Rebecca's best lace tablecloth, because I think she probably got the nicer covering because that's the one he had molested. So, and if you cover the body, it's someone you don't want them looking at you in the afterlife. I don't really know. So the 2 grandsons, the baby grandsons, were wrapped in plastic sheeting and left in abandoned cars at the end of the property in the trunk. And then after all of the murders, he's now up to 14. He goes to a bar and has a couple drinks, holiday. He goes back to the house and lines up the corpses and then spends the rest of the night watching TV and drinking beer. I'm wondering what he watched. Like old episodes of Murder, She Wrote or Matlock. I don't know how he watched television because they didn't have electricity. But maybe he had a battery-powered tiny little TV, like you could watch baseball games in the garage.
Maybe they had a generator. I'm guessing out there in the country they could do that.
Maybe, but if you shit in a hole in the ground, do you even want to generate? I guess anyway. So he watched TV somewhere, maybe just the TV in his brain. So on the morning of the 28th of December, he drives to Russellville, and he walked into a law office and just shot a receptionist right in the head. A beautiful woman named Kathy Kendrick, who he had been infatuated with, but she had rejected him, which is heartbreaking because he looked like one of the lost members of ZZ Top, like a beard down, to his ball sack, and just adorable, man. So I can't believe that she, rejected him. But anyway, so he shot her, and then he went to an oil company, shot a complete and utter stranger named J.D. Chaffin, just a stranger, and then shot and wounded the owner of the oil company, Rusty Taylor. And then he drove to the convenience store where he worked. He shot 2 people there, just wounded them. And then he went to the office where he was the accounts receivable clerk, the Woodline Motor Freight Company. And he shot and wounded a secretary, and then sat down with one of the other secretaries. So I guess he decided, maybe he was out of bullets or out of lace tablecloths to cover her. I don't know. But he sat down and had a lovely conversation with her while waiting for the police. And when they arrived, he handed over his gun and surrendered with no resistance and said his last name was Johnson. I thought that was hilarious. I don't know why, but I just think it's funny of all the names. He's just like, yeah, my name's Johnson. So he was charged with 16 counts of murder and found guilty and sentenced to death. So in Arkansas, you can actually pick your death. I don't think you can be like, I'd like to die by being smothered by 18 tits belonging to the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders. I don't think you can do that. But he picked lethal injection. So he asked for the death penalty and asked to be put to death quickly. So he actually was. I've never even seen a case where within 3 years the defendant is put to death. But he said, to those who oppose the death penalty, in my particular case, anything short of death would be cruel and unusual punishment. Probably meaning that he couldn't roam about his exquisite 13-acre tract of shit holes and dead people. So he didn't want to be locked up in a cage like an animal. So he actually made another statement. I, Ronald Gene Simmons Sr., want it to be known that this is my wish and my desire that absolutely no action by anyone be taken to appeal or in any way change the sentence. It's further respectfully requested that the sentence be carried out expeditiously. So a weird footnote is that another inmate, Jonas Whitmore, attempted unsuccessfully to force an appeal of Simmons' case. So Simmons had to be put in solitary confinement because his life was in danger all the time, which is hilarious because he's on death row. Why did they just let a prison inmate shiv him? Because he, the other inmates on death row were like, he is harsh on our buzz, and he is not going to let, him not fighting or appealing his case is not going to, put me down. We're going to appeal his case for him. But it was unsuccessful. It was thrown out.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it was a United States Supreme Court case, Whitmore versus Arkansas.
God.
Yeah.
So he asked to be executed expeditiously,
yes,
and the court allowed that.
Yes.
Nowadays, I don't think they'd allow that. They'd probably say
he was crazy.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
Interestingly enough, that's what they would do. They'd say, "Oh, wait a minute. If he wants to do this, there's got to be something wrong," and they would carry out the appeal for another decade or more. That's interesting.
It's one of the things I do like about Arkansas. That, and the other thing is who came from there. So on May 31st, Arkansas governor and later President Bill Clinton signed Simmons's execution warrant, and on June 25th of 1990, he died by the method he had chosen, lethal injection. None of his relatives would claim his body, and he was buried in Potter's Field. So I feel like the fact that he was sentenced to 16 death sentences, I feel like he should be put to death 16 times. And I feel like they should put him in a rain barrel, face first, or strangle him. Maybe shoot him like twice, like someplace, we don't die immediately, but hurts like a mofo, like in the knee or something. Like shoot him in both knees and then drown him until you think he stops moving in a rain barrel and then pull him up and then drown him and then maybe strangle him and then drown him.
I'm glad it's a podcast because if this were over the air and somebody just happened to tune in right when you were doing that last bit right there. I don't know.
Please.
That would.
I've had the sheriff's department called on me before.
We'd probably have really good ratings, though.
Well, right. Remember the bit about the burial in Angeles Forest?
Yes.
Yeah. It was a private burial. Yeah. Anyway, and the sheriff's department called Premier Radio Networks, where I worked.
This is Melissa wrote for a nationally syndicated radio show. That was a comedy show, and they did a bit about
a private burial in the Angeles National Forest, where the husband had to shine the lights from his car so he could see to dig the hole, but his wife had asked him to kill her, strangle her. It was good. And the sheriff's department, actually what happened was a listener called the sheriff's department and said, these people are talking to a guy who wasn't real, by the way. And the sheriff's department called, and the CEO of Premier Radio Networks had to come down the hall and go, hey, listen, you guys aren't talking to somebody who's killed his wife, are you? And it's like, well, yes, but he's not a real person, so his fake wife isn't really dead. So anyway, yeah, don't worry about that. I've had the sheriff's department call me so many times. It's not even. So anyway, that is the holiday edition of Just the Tipsters, and I can't wait for what's coming up and more cowbell.
And remember, if you've got a tip for Melissa, whether it be murder, mayhem, yoga pose, recipe, anything, drop us a line at jttipsters@gmail.com.